divided between the two leaders or their designees prior to a vote on passage of the bill, that no amendments be in order prior to the vote, and that the vote on passage be subject to a 60 affirmative vote threshold. Further, that if the bill is not passed, it remain the pending business and the majority leader be recognized.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
Reserving the right to object, and I must reject, but I want to make clear that the senator from California understands that I didn't come to the floor to object to her request, but on behalf of the Republican leader, I do object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, I just want to thank my colleague. We are buddies. We work together on a lot of good government issues. But the minority leader, the Republican leader, is objecting. So in summing this up, as I leave the floor, I would ask rhetorically why on earth the Republican leader is afraid to vote on a Republican bill, other than the fact that that bill really, in my view, exposes a set of values that are not consistent with the American people. I thank you very much, and I yield the floor, and I note, is my colleague going to speak? I thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
I would ask unanimous consent to speak for what time I might consume, but I wouldn't expect it would be more than 30 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have come to the floor to speak about fast and furious investigation, but I would also like to follow up and have this portion of my remarks follow the senator from California, because I think that my side has a legitimate position to take on some job creation things that are in the House bill that has come over here, that if people just hear one side of the story, they might understand that we're not interested in creating jobs, and that we're only interested in putting stumbling blocks in the way of regulations or president decisions that are made. But it's directly related to, in the case of rules by EPA that the senator spoke about, it is a fact that under this administration there's just an explosion of regulations. And a lot of those regulations, because of their cost, have led to the elimination of a lot of jobs, or a lot of jobs not being created as a result thereof. So if we hear a president of the United States saying that we ought to pass legislation to create jobs that he's for, or because we hear the president of the United States 1 or 2 times a week flying all over the country at taxpayers' expense to give political speeches and asking for put the pressure on Congress to pass his jobs bill, at the very same time that his departments are issuing regulations costing jobs or not creating jobs, or the president making a decision that you shouldn't build a pipeline from Canada down to Texas so we can import more oil in a cost-effective way from our friend Canada, a reliable friend, instead of spending $830 million every day to import oil and paying that to countries that either hate us or want to kill us. We think that there's an inconsistency between a president that's going around the country giving speeches on why Congress isn't passing his legislation to create jobs, when his administration is making decisions. In the case of the pipeline, 20,000 jobs could be created right now, union-paying jobs, good jobs, and 110,000 jobs on the side related thereto, plus what it does good for the energy policy of the United States to have that built. And the president's standing in the way. He says it takes another year of study. Well, the State Department's already given 2 studies over a period of years saying it's okay to go ahead. It's not an environmental problem. Nebraska legislature held it up for a little while because of the aquifer, but they've reached an agreement that it can go through their state in just a little different direction. Well, we think that we ought to create those 20,000 jobs, and we ought to do it right now. And this legislation that's come over from the House does that. This legislation coming over from the House puts some block of some regulations going into effect that's going to eliminate jobs or stop the creation of jobs. And so we're a little bit irritated about the inconsistency between an administration that wants us to pass legislation to create jobs when at the very same time one person is making a decision that we're not going to move ahead with job creation projects. And this legislation allows to move ahead for that. The reason I came to the Senate is to give my colleagues an update on the Fast and Furious investigation that I've been conducting since last January 31st. For almost 11 months now, I've been investigating Fast and Furious, an operation of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF. On December the 2nd, the Justice Department finally came clean about who helped draft its February 4th letter to Congress. That was a letter that I wrote that they responded to since I opened the investigation on January 31st. It only took them a few days to get back a letter to me that had a tremendous number of falsehoods in it. That letter falsely denied ATF whistleblower allegations that ATF walked guns. The revelation in the December 2nd documents of this year were the last straw for me. They admitted that that February 4th letter had falsehoods in it. I called for Assistant Secretary General Brewer to step down. And I don't do that lightly. Earlier documents had already shown that Mr. Brewer displayed a stunning lack of judgment in failing to respond adequately when told guns had walked in Operation Wide Receiver in the years 2006 to 2007. The December 2nd document showed that Mr. Brewer was far more informed during the drafting of the February 4th letter than he admitted before the Judiciary Committee just 1 month earlier. These two issues led me to call for the resignation of Mr. Brewer, the highest-ranking official in the Justice Department who knew about gun walking in Operation Wide Receiver. The December 2nd documents also established a number of other key points. The first is that the Justice Department has a flawed process for responding to letters from Congress that involve whistleblowers. So any of my colleagues, any 99 other senators that are writing letters to the Justice Department understand that they have a flawed process if it involves whistleblowers to responding to us, and I will show that to you. In the cover letter that accompanied the documents, the Justice Department wrote that in drafting their February 4th response, which had these falsehoods in it, quote, Department personnel relied on information provided by supervisors from the components in the best position to know the relevant facts. Well, they were listening to supervisors. Because they only listen to supervisors, that's the problem with not answering the letters in a truthful way to me 5 days later after I handed them to the Attorney General. And I'll show that in just a minute. Clearly, the Justice Department did not rely on those in the best position to know the facts, since the letter was withdrawn on December the 2nd due to its inaccuracies. Now, I don't know how you can withdraw a letter that's in the public domain, but they just somehow withdraw the letter. The whistleblowers were in the best position to know the facts. Frontline personnel, not supervisors, were in the best position to know the facts, not these senior bureaucrats or political appointees. Yet the department failed to provide credible process for whistleblowers, people that know what's happening on a day-to-day basis, and other frontline personnel to provide information without fear of retaliation. Employees simply do not believe that they're free to report misconduct because they see what happens to those who speak out. They know it's a career killer because the ATF and the Justice Department culture protects those who retaliate against whistleblowers. Yet whistleblowers in this case spoke out anyway. In other words, these whistleblowers were speaking out, taking a chance on their professional future in federal government because they knew something wasn't right about the walking of guns. So they risked their career to make sure that truth was known. You know, the only crime committed by whistleblowers generally is the crime of committing truth. But when the Office of Legislative Affairs sought information to respond to my inquiries, it didn't ask these brave whistleblowers what happened. Instead, it simply relied on self-serving denials of senior officials at ATF headquarters or the criminal division here in D.C. or the U.S. attorneys in Arizona. In other words, the department took the word of the very officials the whistleblowers alleged had mismanaged the situation in the very first place without getting both sides of the story. The U.S. attorney has since admitted in testimony to congressional investigators that he was too strident when he first heard these accusations. He claimed he didn't know all the facts. You can't rely on the chain of command when you have a whistleblower. By definition, whistleblowers emerge because the chain of command is broken. Whistleblowers come to Congress because they're unsuccessful in getting their supervisors to address fraud, waste, and abuse. Sometimes those supervisors attempt to cover tracks and paper over the problem. That's why you have to get the story straight from the horse's mouth. You can't let the facts be filtered through multiple layers of bureaucracy. After all, the bureaucracy is filled with the same supervisors who should have done something about the problem in the very first place, before whistleblowers even come forward. These problems are particularly prevalent in the federal government that is so very large. It is virtually impossible for anyone to ever be held accountable for anything. So it's crucial that those investigating whistleblower allegations go straight to those on the ground level with firsthand knowledge of the facts. Their goal should be to understand the underlying facts of the whistleblower allegations, not to intimidate whistleblowers into silence. Instead, inquiries all too often focus on the whistleblowers themselves and what skeletons they have in their closet. That approach is exactly what's wrong with the federal government and why it doesn't function as efficiently as it can. Because if more whistleblowers were listened to and wrongs were brought to the surface and transparency ruled, there'd be more accountability. The focus should be on whether the accusations are true so that the problems can be corrected. Too often, however, the focus is on finding out what information the whistleblower disclosed so the agency can circle the wagons and build a defense. That needs to change. If the department is going to regain its credibility, it needs to provide straight answers, not talking points and spin. The only way to provide straight answers is to make sure that you get straight answers in the first place. That's one reason that we have pushed in our investigation to be able to interview frontline personnel. The Justice Department objected in a letter Tuesday night. In that letter, the Justice Department also objected to us talking to first or second level supervisors. This is exactly the sort of approach that prevents key information from getting to senior officials and to Congress and impeding Congress's constitutional responsibility to see that the laws are faithfully executed. In other words, we don't just pass laws and say that's the end of it. We have to pass laws to make sure that we're a check on the executive branch of government, and that means do the constitutional job of oversight. That means ask questions. That means we're entitled to answers, unless somebody's trying to cover up something. And when they try to cover up something in the bureaucracy, I always tell them, you get stonewalled. Eventually the truth's going to come out, and the more truth that comes out, the more egg you're going to have on your face. And Mr. Brewer's one of those that has tremendous egg on his face. Justice cites the so-called lying personnel policy for refusing to provide officials for voluntary interviews. Now, the policy is based purely on nothing but the department's own preferences. This isn't any law. or statute or even case law. The Department has frequently set aside the policy and made exceptions. For example, line attorneys gave transcribed interviews under oath to Congress in the 1992 Rocky Flats nuclear weapons facility investigation. As recently as October, Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Lieber, the line attorney responsible for the anthrax investigations, participated in an interview with the PBS Frontline. How can the Justice Department tell me or argue to Congress that Congress should not be allowed access to line attorneys when they give that same kind of access to the press? Those are the kind of line personnel, the individuals who have the actual answers. I kind of surmise that the reason the Justice Department will let a U.S. attorney or some FBI agents be interviewed on television, that some public affairs officer has looked at it and said, well, you know, this is a good story. This is going to make us look good. But when Congress wants to interview lying people, no. And we got a constitutional responsibility to do that. I'd like to suggest that the Justice Department let the public affairs people make a decision of who can talk to Congress or not, because it might make them look a little better if they'll let us talk to Congress. Or are they afraid we might find something out? It's just as irritating as heck. In this case, had the Justice Department gone to the horse's mouth before sending an inaccurate letter to me on February the 4th, they would have been able to get the story straight. The memo that I have here that I'm not going to read from the memo, but I want to hold it up. The memo is from an ATF line agent who substantiated the claims of the first ATF whistleblowers. I ask unanimous consent that copy be placed in the record immediately after my remarks.
Without objection.
It is dated February the 3rd, 2011, the day before the Justice Department sent their letter to me. The memo was passed up his chain in response to investigators on my staff talking to him about Operation Fast and Furious. He accurately described the problems with Fast and Furious. What he said was consistent with the claims that I had already heard from other whistleblowers. Information like this is why I was skeptical days later when the Department sent its February 4th letter to me denying the allegations. In other words, I had proof that they were lying to us. The agent wrote in the memo about being ordered by Fast and Furious case agent to hold back in their surveillance so that they didn't, quote, unquote, burn the operation. While watching straw purchasers hand off weapons to traffickers, violating the laws of this country but encouraged to do it by the own Justice Department, the case agent, quote, told all the agents to leave the immediate area, end of quote. While a crime was being committed, the agent said to the agents to leave the area immediately. The memo explicitly says, quote, the transaction between the suspects took place and the vehicle that took possession of the firearms eventually left the area without agents following it. A crime's committed, U.S. agents there, just let them move on. After the phone call with my staff, the ATF agent supervisor requested that he write this memo documenting what he had told my investigators. It was passed up the chain all the way to ATF leadership. We know that because there are emails attaching the memo sent to senior headquarter officials. However, the Justice Department has refused to provide copies of those emails and will only allow them to be reviewed at Justice Department headquarters. The memo has also refused to, or the Department has also refused to provide a copy of this memo. My staff had to obtain it from confidential sources. One of the questions yet to be answered is who in the Justice Department saw the memo and when. Either way, once the Justice Department got a hold of it, they tried to keep it under wraps by refusing to give me a copy. They made my staff go to the Justice Department to view it, even though the entire memo simply recounts information that was already provided to my staff. It's just embarrassing to the Department because it shows that the truth was easily knowable before the false denial was sent to Congress on February the 4th. If they'd asked for first-hand documentation like this memo when they first got my letter in January, we wouldn't be where we are today. The second point these documents establish is that Maine Justice had problems of its own. It wasn't all the fault of the ATF or the U.S. Attorney. Mr. Brewer, Deputy Assistant Attorney General Jason Weinstein participated in drafting a false statement. The Justice Department February 4th letter read, quote, ATF makes every effort to interdict weapons that have been purchased illegally and prevent their transportation to Mexico, end of quote. Documents show that line originated in a phone conversation February the 1st, 2011 between Justice Department Legislative Affairs, Assistant Director Billy Hoover from ATF, and Jason Weinstein from Maine Justice's Criminal Division. Like Assistant Attorney General Brewer, Mr. Weinstein knew that ATF had let hundreds of weapons walk in Operation Wide Receiver, which was an earlier, smaller-scale case than Fast and Furious. In fact, in April 2010, he brought that fact to the attention of Mr. Brewer, his boss. Now, April 2010 is 8 months before I got involved in this investigation. His email to Mr. Brewer about Wide Receiver said, quote, as you'll recall from Jim's briefing, ATF let a bunch of guns walk in efforts to get upstream conspirators, but only got straws and didn't recover many guns. Some were recovered in Mexico after being used in crimes, end of quote. It's ironic that that's how Mr. Weinstein described Wide Receiver. He was one of the officials who authorized wiretaps in Fast and Furious. Therefore, he was in a position to know that exact same description applied to Fast and Furious. Yet he allowed the myth to be perpetrated that ATF would never do such a thing. Mr. Weinstein saw the Justice Department's very first draft of the letter to Congress. In fact, as one of his Justice Department colleagues in the Deputy Attorney General's office said, quote, CRM, which parenthetically happens to be the Criminal Division, and OLA, which is the Office of Legislative Affairs. So let me back up. CRM and OLA basically drafted it. Mr. Weinstein, that's the end of quote. Mr. Weinstein knew the letter contained a blatantly false line, yet he did nothing to correct it, and that line thus remained in every successive draft of the letter. On December 2 this year, the Justice Department's latest spin was that its statement that ATF, quote, that ATF makes every effort to interdict weapons, end of quote, was, quote, unquote, aspirational. Nevertheless, that didn't stop them from withdrawing the letter for inaccuracies. Perhaps the aspirational language should be saved for mission statements. Responses to specific and serious allegations ought to, in a common sense way, ought to just stick to the facts, right? This was an oversight letter. I was not asking for some feel-good, fuzzy message about what ATF aspired to. I was asking for simple facts. A U.S. Border Patrol agent had died, and at the scene of his death were 2 guns from Fast and Furious. So his death was connected to the ATF operation. Whistleblowers were reaching outside of the chain of command because supervisors wouldn't listen. Instead of treating these allegations with the kind of seriousness they deserved, the Justice Department resorted to damage control. Now, I don't know what else my investigation is going to uncover, but we're going to pursue it until we get to the end of it, because my goal is to find out who at the highest level of government, in Justice or the White House, approved this and get them fired. Make sure that the Terry family gets all of their information about the death of their son. To this point, they've got hardly anything. And 3, to make sure a stupid program like Walking Guns, Fast and Furious, etc., never happens again. Just this week, the investigation revealed that shortly after the February 4th letter, Lanny Breuer asked Mr. Weinstein to write up an analytical memo of Fast and Furious. This suggests that Mr. Breuer and his deputy, Mr. Weinstein, were down in the weeds on Operation Fast and Furious a lot earlier than previously admitted. Mr. Weinstein was in an excellent position to write such a memo, since Mr. Breuer has acknowledged that Mr. Weinstein was one of the individuals who approved wiretaps in the summer of 2010 as part of Operation Fast and Furious. However, we had to learn of this memo from sources not from the Justice Department, but from outside of the Justice Department. The Justice Department has not provided it to us, even though it is clearly responsive to a House Oversight and Government Reform Committee's October 25th subpoena. This type of maneuvering is what got the Justice Department in trouble to begin with. The Justice Department should produce this document immediately, along with all the other responsive documents. This investigation will continue. People must be held accountable. The Justice Department must stop stonewalling today. Mr. President, I don't see another member on the floor unless some staff person of the Republicans or Democrats tell me somebody's coming. I'd like to take another 5 minutes if I could.
Without objection.
Mr. President, more like 7 or 8 minutes.
Without objection.
Okay. Mr. President, the cornerstone of Congress's ability to effectively oversee the federal government is the free and open access to information. In other words, congressional oversight, what I just was talking about in regard to Fast and Furious. Well, on another investigation, 231 days ago, on April the 27th, I made a very simple request. I requested that the Federal Communications Commission turn over communications regarding its controversial approval of Light Squared project. Light Squared is a company owned by a hedge fund called Harbinger Capital Partners that is seeking FCC approval to use its satellite spectrum to build terrestrial wireless network. To accomplish its goals, Light Squared has already spent millions of dollars on lobbyists and made large political donations. The problem is that Light Squared's signals would, according to federal government tests, cause massive interference with global positioning systems, or more commonly referred to as GPS. GPS, as you know, is a critical tool for everything from military drones and missiles to cars and ship navigation. Light Squared's initial plan, which the FCC conditionally approved, would have interfered with just about every single GPS user. The surprising fact is that there's no evidence the FCC even tested Light Squared's plan before approving it. In fact, the FCC granted this waiver, which is estimated to be worth at least $10 billion to Light Squared, in a shortened comment period starting right around Thanksgiving 2010. Giving a company a possible $10 billion windfall in a holiday-shortened comment period without doing any testing is very suspicious. Risking our nation's GPS assets, including the role they played in defending our nation, to accomplish this goal is downright dangerous. The question I'm asking is, why would the FCC do this? And, of course, to get to the bottom of this question, I asked the Federal Communications Commission for some documents. Again, just a simple question for some information. The FCC, an agency whose employees are supposed to work for the American people, said no to my request. My staff was told that the FCC intentionally ignored my document request. The FCC officials said that they have determined that they will only be responsive to two members of Congress, the chairs of the House and Senate Commerce Committees, not even to ranking members of those same committees. And, of course, not to members of those committees, whether you're majority or minority. And presumably they wouldn't even answer to the majority leader of the Senate or to the Speaker of the House. But for sure, they surely aren't answering to this senior senator from Iowa. Now, if you happen to be one of the 99 6/10% of the Congress who doesn't chair one of those two committees, well, from the FCC's point of view, sorry, you're out of luck. No documents for you. This attitude is unacceptable. I conveyed my concerns to the FCC again on July the 5th and asked again for documents. Again, I was stonewalled. This time, the FCC claimed that since I can't subpoena the FCC, it would not respond. President Obama committed to run the most transparent administration in history. Yet the FCC is saying, if you can't force us to be open, we won't do it. I wrote another letter asking the FCC for documents on September the 8th. And again, I was stonewalled. This brings us to where we are today, 230-some days later. The FCC's decision to impede Congress's constitutional duty of oversight has forced me to make a difficult decision. I do not take that decision to hold up nominees lightly, but I never do it in secret. I always put a statement in the record, and this is in addition to that statement. But when an agency flagrantly disregards congressional oversight, something must be done. Before I publicly announced my intention to hold the nominees, I, through staff, contacted the FCC officials. I informed them that if the documents were not forthcoming, I would hold up the Federal Communications Commission's nominees that the President sent up here. I was surprised, probably shouldn't have been, and I was disappointed by their response. Despite knowing my intentions, they chose not to provide any documents. As a result, I'm honoring my promise to hold those nominees. It is unfortunate that the FCC has chosen this path. Due to the FCC's decision to hide its actions from the public and Congress, these nominations are now stalled in the Senate. The question I would ask today of my colleagues and the President of the Senate is why. The FCC has already told me that it would likely provide these documents if certain other members, chairmen of committees, ask for them. But somehow, 99 6/10% of the Congress otherwise has no right to this information. In other words, 99 6/10% of the members of Congress can't do their constitutional job of oversight of the Federal Communications Commission. To paraphrase a very popular slogan these days, I guess that makes me part of the 99 6/10%. My concern is not just specific to this document request, it's broader than that. In the future, any member of Congress may request documents from the FCC. As the courts have put it, every member has a voice and a vote in the process under our Constitution. Each one of us has the authority to request and receive information from the executive branch in order to inform those votes. That's what our court has said. That authority is inherent in each member's responsibility to participate in the legislative process. The creation of the committee system and the delegation of certain responsibilities to committee chairmen doesn't change that at all. Individual members still have a right, as well as a responsibility, to inform themselves by requesting information directly from agencies. For Congress to have a complete view of how an agency works, we need to have access to documents. Turning off that flow of information short circuits transparency and hurts accountability. In this case, the Federal Communications Commission's actions have real-world effects. The FCC's decision to grant a waiver to Light Squared created uncertainties for GPS users, and that includes our own national defense agency, the Department of Defense, and other federal agencies. Another one is the Federal Aviation Administration claims that 800 people would die as a result of Light Squared's initial proposed network. To the FAA, the FCC's decision could have killed people. The Department of Defense wrote a letter to the FCC saying that it was not consulted by the FCC. And press reports say that the General Skelton, who heads up GPS for the armed forces, said that Light Squared's interference would harm the military's use of GPS. To the Department of Defense, the Federal Communications Commission's actions would have harmed national security. These are only two agencies, but the Department of Transportation, NASA, NOAA, among others, have also raised concerns about Light Squared's plan. The effects of the FCC's decision aren't just limited to the federal government. They also affect ordinary Americans. Just two examples. For Americans who hope that next-gen air traffic control will reduce air traffic delays, the FCC's action would have continued to increase air traffic, wasting time, fuel, and ultimately money for the flying public. For Americans who use precision agriculture to save time and money, the FCC's actions would harm the accuracy and reliability of their equipment. This again leads to wasted energy, lower crop yields, higher prices for products like wheat and corn. At the end of the day, the FCC's actions would cost the American consumers money. Does the FCC even care? I don't know. But the agency certainly has not provided any evidence that it took any of this information into consideration. What we see today is an agency that is completely unaccountable and unanswerable to 99 6/10% of the Congress and by extension the American public. This is simply wrong, and I will continue to hold the FCC's nominees until this attitude changes. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island is recognized.
Mr. President, I have 8 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to urge my colleagues to immediately extend the payroll tax cut and to fully continue jobless benefits for millions of Americans. In less than 3 weeks, 160 million Americans face an automatic tax increase, and millions of out-of-work Americans will begin to lose their jobless benefits. In order to keep our economy on track, we must continue the payroll tax cut and jobless benefits for millions of out-of-work Americans. My state of Rhode Island, in particular, has felt the economic downturn acutely. And with 4 unemployed job seekers for every 1 job, middle-class families are struggling to get by. The possibility that Congress would let these payroll tax cuts and jobless benefits expire is unthinkable. I've joined my colleagues on this side of the aisle and voted time and again to cut taxes for middle-class families, and each time our Republican colleagues have opposed the measure because they value tax breaks for the top 0.1% of income earners more than they do middle-class Americans. Republicans have even rejected our effort to provide tax cuts to businesses and provide them incentives to hire. So in response, Democrats narrowed the focus of the tax cuts to employees, but Republicans again refused to provide a tax cut for the middle class because it was paid for by asking the top 1/10 of 1% of Americans to contribute. We have seen the refusal of Republicans to invest in our nation's roads and bridges and schools and other policies that will create jobs because Republicans cling to their belief that the wealthiest in our nation should not have to share in the sacrifice every other American has made during these very difficult economic times. Republicans have voted in favor of millionaires and billionaires 5 times, costing middle-class Americans tax cuts and the continuation of jobless benefits and other policies that would help create and sustain jobs. And the Republicans are not putting forward serious proposals. The House Republican extended plan that passed that body yesterday is the latest example of not only brinksmanship but ideological rigidity. Instead of working with Americans on reaching a sensible compromise that works for all Americans, the House Republicans voted to slash the current unemployment insurance program nearly in half, eliminated target relief for the hardest hit states like my state of Rhode Island, but Rhode Island's not alone in this category. And even as our job market is still weak and 14 million Americans out of work, they refused to pass this critical legislation, particularly with respect to unemployment insurance. Instead, they're working to put an end to it by implementing aggressive waivers leading to block granting and creating artificial barriers, all with the long-term goal of dismantling the system. Republicans would blunt one of the most effective counter-cyclical tools and would ultimately throw it away. At the core of the Republican Party's efforts to reduce jobless benefits is the, I think, terribly misguided belief that Americans don't want to work. They want to work, but we have to create jobs or help incentivize the private sector to create jobs so that they can work. Instead of compromising and focusing on economic policies that will help create jobs, help the middle class, House Republicans focused on dead-on-arrival special interest pet projects like the Keystone Pipeline and further efforts to weaken the Clean Air Act. The Republican plan ignores the reality and the challenges that face American families to maintain their home, to maintain their jobs, to provide for the future of their families and their children and their retirement. For those who have lost their jobs in one of the worst economic downturns we've ever faced, unemployment insurance is a lifeline. It's also important for Main Street businesses that rely on these dollars. The grocery stores, the drug stores, all of them depend on people having some cash to come in and take care of the necessities of life. Without extension of jobless benefits, consumers will pull back spending, hurt local businesses, and decelerate the progress that we've made. We have had 20 months of job growth, not sufficient to satisfy the demands across the country, but in stark contrast to the absolute collapse of employment in the last months of the Bush administration. That's not been an accident. That's been a result of decisions that the President and Congress made, the Recovery Act, other programs that have helped keep the economy moving, too slowly, but keep it moving forward. The Economic Policy Institute has estimated when they've looked at these UI benefits that if we don't extend them, we could lose $72 billion of economic activity in 2012. $72 billion pulled out of the economy. $72 billion of lessened demand, slowing the economy down and slowing job creation down. These are challenging times for millions of Americans. We cannot afford to let Congress be sidetracked by marginal issues. The core issues are very clear. Extend tax cuts for middle-class Americans. Provide continued unemployment benefits to those desperately searching for work. We're facing a tough job market. We've got to pass these measures. It has to be a clean tax for millions of Americans, a clean tax cut for millions of Americans, and we have to continue these jobless benefits. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. President.
Senator from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, when
Currently in a quorum call.
I ask that the quorum be rescinded.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, when President Obama was sworn into office, the nation's average price for a gallon of gasoline was under $2. We all know that that is not the case today. In most parts of the country, gas remains well over $3 a gallon. In my home state of Arkansas, the price of gas ranges anywhere from just under $3 to $3.50 a gallon. The only reason that it's staying at a steady price is because there is decreased demand because of the poor economy. Business owners will tell you that when the price of gas hits $3.50 a gallon, it truly does affect how decisions are made. When it hits the $4 mark, things really start to shut down in terms of the economy because the average person's disposable income is going to the gas pump instead of local businesses. That is our country at this time lacks an energy policy. We're also facing a jobs crisis of enormous magnitude, and our president is standing in the way of one project that can help address both of these problems, the Keystone XL pipeline. The proposed 1,700-mile pipeline would transport 700,000 barrels of oil per day from Canada to the United States refineries on the Gulf Coast. Canada's oil sands are among the largest oil reserves in the world. As a global demand for oil surges and Canada increases production, the addition of the Keystone pipeline will ensure that Americans benefit from reliable and secure oil from our largest trading partner and trusted ally. The $7 billion cost to be paid by the Keystone Consortium will fund nearly $500 million in salaries. It will result in the purchase of $6.5 billion worth of materials, services, and other local economic activity. None of this with any federal money. It is a no-brainer. Some of these jobs are in my home state of Arkansas. Wellspun Tubular Company, which makes pipes for the oil industry, has been producing pipe for the Keystone Project. Unfortunately, due to the administration's delay on Keystone, the company has already begun to lay off workers in Little Rock. They have 500 miles of pipe that was produced for the project, ready to go, that's just sitting in the facility. Postponing the start of the project is putting more Americans out of work instead of putting Americans to work. Delaying this project costs thousands of well-paying jobs when Americans need reliable employment, and it hurts Arkansas businesses that have invested millions of dollars to help produce the pipeline. It's also a major step backwards for energy policy goals, reducing our dependence on oil from unstable regimes. When it comes to energy policy, I'm kind of a T. Boone Pickens guy. I firmly believe that if it's American, we need to be using it. This goes for not only the renewable forms of energy, but the vast amount of fossil fuels that we've been blessed with throughout the United States and directly off our shores. If we use what we have here in a responsible manner, we can be better positioned to pick and choose who we import our remaining oil needs from. Importing oil from Canada will accelerate America's independence for overseas oil by increasing petroleum trade with one of our most reliable allies, one of our most reliable friends, instead of depending on the likes of Saudi Arabia and hostile regimes like Venezuela for much of our oil. The amount of oil provided through this project is equal to half the amount we import from the Middle East. I doubt that anyone in this body would argue that any of the countries that we import oil from in that region are more stable than Canada. President Obama needs to quit pandering to the radical environmentalist. He needs to do what is best for the country, not what he perceives as best for his reelection. The Keystone Pipeline is what is best for America. Let's move forward with it. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. The Senate's in a quorum call after earlier today rejecting two versions, the Democratic and Republican version, of the measures that would provide for a balanced budget agreement. Those votes were part of the deal made back in August on raising the debt ceiling. Both of those failed to garner the amount of votes to move forward and pass in the Senate. Also earlier today in the Senate, as the Senate came in, Mitch McConnell objected to a Democratic request to vote on the bill the House passed yesterday, the payroll tax cut extension. And the Hill writes that Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid said that Senator McConnell blocked a vote on the bill because Republican senators did not want to take a stance on controversial provisions in that bill, such as requiring the recipients of unemployment benefits to take drug tests. The Hill says that Reid offered a motion to fast-track a short-term spending measure to keep the government operating into next week, but Senator McConnell objected to that request. The payroll tax cut passed in the House yesterday by a vote of 234 to 193. Today in the House, they are working on the 2012 Defense Authorization Conference Report, the compromise version worked out between House and Senate negotiators. They're just underway. A procedural vote is underway and more debate ahead in the House, and you can follow that on C-SPAN.
A couple of stories about what happened in the Senate today. The Congressional Quarterly writing that Senate party leaders fought on the floor over whether to take up a House-passed bill to extend the Social Security payroll tax cut. Continuing that story from Congressional Quarterly. So Senate party leaders fought today on the floor about whether to take up an extension of the payroll tax cut and whether to advance another stopgap to keep the government running while lawmakers resolve the conflict over the package. Senate Majority Leader Reid said he wanted to quote, put this useless partisan charade behind us and prove that the bill would not pass in the Senate. Washington Post writes that Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell objected, arguing that in a divided Congress, the tax fight must be worked out by Reid and House Speaker John Boehner.